Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast. This is episode 33. I'm so excited that you're here. Pastor Mike, welcome to episode 33 of your podcast.
What's the laugh about?
I'm just welcoming you to your own podcast. Seems entertaining to me, but
well, you're entertained by small things.
Yes, you have to be when you have children.
Okay.
We're one episode away from my favorite number. So next
32 or 34?
Wow, 34. 34.
It's just one number away, so I didn't know which way you were
34
going.
will be our Kirby Puckett episode, and we will only talk about Kirby Puckett instead of relationships. Does that sound good to you?
That might be one of the few sports figures that I really know their name and kind of what they did. And there's not many like that.
But today we're not talking about Kirby Puckett.
No, we aren't.
No. Today we're talking about relationships.
Relationships.
And
on
messes.
This day that it's released, it's Valentine's Day.
It is. It's Valentine's Day.
What are your plans for Valentine's Day?
Nothing.
Wow.
I'm a big anti-Valentine's Day person.
Wow. I'm sorry, Joanna.
Joanna is on board with my hatred of Valentine's Day. I assume only because I make sure to do nice things for her on days where I'm not required to by greeting card companies.
Okay.
She usually gets, some Reese's chocolate, so every once in a while some flowers, but we don't do Valentine's Day things.
We typically don't on Valentine's Day because it's just all over the place. You can't do stuff, but we try to do something.
What's your go-to Valentine's Day activity?
It varies. Well, we try to get creative. We've done anything from, if the weather's nice, going out on hikes that day.
But you live in North Dakota, so
we live in North Dakota, so it doesn't always happen. Although we've done like cold weather hikes, to restaurants, but not on the day.
Sure,
do something at home,
so you don't have to pay twice as much money for half the menu on Valentine's Day. That always. I remember when Joanna and I were dating, and we went out to a nice restaurant on Valentine's Day. It was the year I proposed, and we had already been talking about it.
Yeah.
And so I had all sorts of plans to trick her into thinking I was going to propose that night. But I remember getting to the restaurant. It's this really nice restaurant that we both liked. And then they hand you the menu, and they're like, here are the 3 options you can order. I was like,
one of those
I'm sorry,
special Valentine's
what
Day,
now?
Yeah.
I was furious. Yeah. I think it's a scam. Restaurant owners, let me order whatever I want on Valentine's Day, please. Yep. Maybe that's why I don't do anything for Valentine's Day. I'm still bitter about that one restaurant experience.
Could be. We're going to be talking about forgiveness in a few weeks.
Good, yeah.
So we can talk about that,
for me.
And do that. I like excuses that give people intentionality to do stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like romantic stuff. So like those of you who are single, use that as an excuse to get together with friends instead of turning it into a negative kind of thing and celebrate friendship on these days. But we aren't here to talk about Valentine's Day. We're here to talk about relationships, which I guess connects.
We are. Yeah, we started our new series yesterday on Super Bowl Sunday. And
I see you're wearing the Vikings shirt and
the Vikings
a sweatshirt, and it's in black, so it's like a day of mourning.
That's the Super Bowl every year is a day of mourning for Vikings fans. But how about that one sports team that won the sports game yesterday? We are recording this, but we don't record these, 2 minutes before they go live, so we don't know who won the Super Bowl yet.
We actually don't.
But I hope it's either the Bengals or the Rams.
It would be awkward if it wasn't one of those two.
But yes, we started our new series, Bless This Mess. It's not a cleaning series.
No.
It's about relationships.
It's so interesting. When we start a series, you always have different interpretations of the titles. Yeah. And I'm a little worried about that. Infinite
and Intimate, I thought was going to be a like Buzz Lightyear dating series, and it was neither of those. Mm-hmm. I don't. Was I confused about the last one? I don't remember.
Christmas at the movies? No, you were involved in putting all that one together, so you weren't really confused.
No, and then in January we had
Best Year Yet. Yes.
That one I often called Best Year Ever.
Best Year Ever.
Yeah, but no, we're talking about relationships, and you by naming it that are implying that all relationships are a mess,
which they are.
But what about my relationship, Pastor Mike? It's perfect.
Yeah, well, if you
said
were
the
with us
listener.
this last weekend, way to set me up. If you were with us this last weekend, we took us back to Genesis. And just after Adam and Eve ate the fruit and eventually got the boot. You like the rhyme there? That was pretty cool.
That was excellent.
That was great. And one of the first things we notice, in fact, maybe the biggest thing, that's the result, the consequence of sin, is relational breakdown between us and God, relational breakdown between us and everybody else. And it explains why relationships are challenging, no matter what. Even the healthiest of them are challenging. We talked about 4 things. I'll just hit them real quick. That Genesis 3 says this will be common in relationship. Distrust will become normal. Blame will become normal. It's one of my favorite moments in all of the Bible where Adam and Eve with God are going, not my fault, it's their fault, not my fault, it's their fault. I'm like, really? You're going to try and get away with that with God?
Almost immediately.
And pain will become part of our world, but especially part of our relational world.
Yeah.
And it's just going to become difficult. It will be hard work. It'll be hard work. So we talked about that just as a reality to set up these next few weeks where we're going to talk about the 3 things that lean into and pull, maybe not lean into, but pull on those 4 results in huge ways. We're going to unpack those the next few weeks. But today I thought we would kind of take part 2 on yesterday, and some of the stuff some of the big stuff that doesn't make it into the message. That's part of what these Grow podcasts are, and talk about, okay, if it's so messed up, before we talk about these big things, how can we begin to deal with the mess? Is that okay with you if we talk about that?
Works for me.
Okay.
Even though, as we established, my relationship's perfect.
Yes.
My wife will confirm that, I'm sure.
We're going to have Joanna on here during this series, and we'll do a little bit of interview.
We should just have her come in frame right now and list all the ways I'm a terrible husband. So tell us, let's get going. You said you're going to tell me how to fix it, how to overcome
Let's talk about it. Well, if you have your Bibles, and depending on where you are, you might want to pull this up later.
Don't pull your Bible out if you're driving.
If you're driving. One of my favorite passages in the entire Bible, and I've got a lot, but really one of my favorites is Romans chapter 12. It's my father-in-law calls there are certain passages kind of the chocolate chip cookies of the Bible, or the perfect meals, because chocolate chip cookie is like most people's kind of go-to dessert. It's like
it's my dad's favorite.
Let's just go to this. There's all kinds of specialty things, but this is it's just goes with almost everything.
Yeah. And
Romans 12 is kind of that way, and walks us through that. But before we're going to unpack that, because Romans 12 is a chapter walking us through how to begin to deal with relationships. There's 2 big things we need to know. First, goes all the way back to Genesis 3. If you want to be part of, and we talked about this on the weekend, if you want to be part of cleaning up the mess of your relationships, you've got to start with your relationship with the Lord. And in Genesis 3, God gives a hint that he's not giving up on Adam and Eve, because he gives us a preview, doesn't he? Gives a preview of talking about someday one of your descendants will crush the serpent's head. He'll strike his heel, and it's referring, of course, to Jesus and the cross and paying the price. Basically saying, I'm not going to give up on you, and I will do everything I can the best way to help restore our relationship, your relationship with God, and all of your other relationships. So the first place, if you want to begin to deal with and not stick your head in the sand about relational messes, is start with your relationship with the Lord, and it starts with forgiveness. And that's kind of how we ended yesterday.
Yeah.
If you were with us or you're listening the day after or this last weekend.
So do I then have to wait until I have a perfect relationship with Jesus before I can start working on my human relationships? No, I said that's the place to start, because you start with forgiveness, and that makes us, deals with our sin, but doesn't make us perfect. So in Romans 12, it begins to walk us through really what I would call 2 things, but we'll review it at the end. 2 big ideas, but we can break them down into 4 that deal with distrust, blame, pain, and the difficulty of relationships. He, I think, specifically addresses these. And Romans is this incredible book. If you aren't familiar with Romans, it's kind of like, well, Martin Luther said, if you're to only leave me with one book of the Bible,
Romans would be it, because it unpacks and helps me understand the entire story of what God's doing and takes me deep and helps me know how to live my life. And that's part of when Paul wrote this. He was writing to a church he'd never been to, the capital city of the empire at the time. He would eventually get there. We know that later. And he was unpacking the entirety of the gospel and how to live this. So he starts out, at the beginning of Romans, talking about here's what it means to why we need Jesus, what sin is. Then he talks about how God deals with sin. He deals with the whole Old Testament story. And so he walks through all of this stuff. And then Romans 12, he says, all right, now for these next few chapters, we're just going to get practical. And here's how this lives out. And he begins to talk about a relationship with God and a relationship with people. And in that, the first thing he deals with when he begins to talk about relationships is the first step in cleaning up your relational world is dealing with your own heart. And he starts with this great verse that some people have memorized. Therefore, after these 11 chapters of theological teaching and background teaching, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, in other words, in view of what God's done, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Of course, he's not saying go out and literally... Not
a human sacrifice.
Yeah, it's not a human sacrifice. A living sacrifice. Chuck Swindoll, one of the great teachers and still is a phenomenal teacher, says the problem with being a living sacrifice is we keep crawling off the altar. This is a moment of surrender. It's an act of love. And so this is where it begins to deal with if we want to bring healing and restoration to our relationships, we have to realize that it's going to cost us something. It costs Jesus. It costs Jesus. And love is ultimately the risk of being hurt. And he's saying, do it anyway. Be a living sacrifice. This will hurt. You're going to have to take the first step often. And just own that it will cost you. And then he goes into verse 2. He talks about do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He's basically saying, this is not the world's pattern. The world's pattern is, you hurt me, I'm going to wait until you come to me. God's pattern is, you messed up, I'm coming to you. Let's go all the way back to the garden. Adam and Eve sinned.
Right.
They hid. And God could have said, I'm going to wait till they figure this out.
Yeah.
He comes and he says, where are you? Even though he knew where they were. He comes. So the first step is basically saying, I'm going to commit to being the first step and taking the first risk, whether it's marriage, dating, whatever, and recognizing there's going to be moments that it hurts, but God's got this. It works in this.
How do we always determine if in this specific relationship that hurt is worth it?
Yeah, that's probably a psychological discussion far beyond this.
And like marriage is different, and I'm not even talking about like abuse and things like that. Just like I have a friendship, or if I was in a dating relationship, and how do I differentiate, I guess, between just the hurt that comes with relationships, where I need to be the first one to then go, and this friendship might not be worth it anymore because I can find somebody that's going to hurt me less.
Yeah. And some of that we learn by experience, don't we?
Sure.
Where we take a risk and we go, okay, I need to watch for some of these warning signs. Yeah. I think part of what this is talking about is we'll tend to, because we get hurt, and then we'll tend to put up the walls.
Sure.
And we don't risk anymore.
Yeah.
I think the point here, one of the primary points here is take the risk. It doesn't mean that you take a risk without boundaries.
Yeah.
When we talk about living sacrifice in the Old Testament, sacrifices were offered to God within a certain way. Here's how we offer sacrifice, and here's how we offer sacrifice. And part of this is here's how we take the risk. And that's probably a discussion for another time that we can go much more in depth to. If I were to refer to someone to some great teaching, Dr. Henry Cloud is one of the foremost teachers. He's a Christian psychologist on how to love well and bring restoration to these things, and how to take healthy boundary risks. And he's written some phenomenal stuff. In fact, he does, I think, a daily live feed on Facebook
cool.
and Instagram where you can listen, and it's just incredible stuff.
Yeah.
So that's where it starts. Recognize you're going to take the first risk. The next, from chapter 3 on down, this is where we want, when hurt happens in a relationship, we want to focus on the other person. One of the things we need to realize in Romans 12, he's talking about you. It starts with you. You cannot change someone else. So you change yourself. So from 3 all the way down through about verse 16, it's dealing with you grow in self-awareness. Grow in self-awareness. And he starts in verse 3. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought.
Yeah.
Now, some people have misinterpreted that and said, you must think of yourself, like the old hymns, I'm just a worm. Do you ever sing those songs in church growing up?
Worm?
There's some of those hymns. It's like, I'm just lowly. Do you not remember that? Are you too young?
I don't know if I remember one singing about being a worm.
There's a couple of them like that out there. I should have looked them up before this. Some of you, if you're listening and joining us and you remember some of those, help me out with the title of those.
Throw that in the comments for sure.
Basically, we've interpreted and misinterpreted this where it says, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought, to mean think less of yourself than you should think. And that's not what he's saying. Is begin to understand who you are and what God says about you.
Yep.
And so this is a journey, it starts with the decision. It's a journey. And it's part of why, and it goes on then in verse 4, why we need the right people in our lives. And we talk about this in the Grow podcast because we're always talking about your personal growth. You cannot grow well without the right people in your life.
Yeah.
You've got to have that. And that's why in verse 4 and on, it talks about, for just as each of us is one body with many members, and these members don't all have the same function. So in Christ, though many, though many form one body. In other words, you've got to be part of the body of Christ and engage in it.
Yeah.
The best way for you to figure out who you are, who God made you to be, your strengths and your weaknesses, things you need to work on, things that God just said, I've made you that way. You call it a weakness, and I kind of like it. Is to have people around you who act as godly mirrors.
Yeah.
And that's not always fun.
No, it's not.
But it goes back to verse 1, a living sacrifice, to recognize there's a risk involved here.
And that's why we do a series on relationships, because we were designed to grow in relationships. And so understanding how to have healthy ones and how to allow those healthy relationships to help you grow in your relationship with Christ is vital.
So I think, one of the big things, recognize, as we talked about, recognize there's going to be some risk, be willing to do it. It's going to look different than the world says.
Yep.
The world says self-care first, self-protection first, and God's saying, no, love first. Love as I loved you. He took the risk.
Yeah.
Then grow in your identity. So spend some time, and a couple of things here. Spend some time reading what the Bible says about you. The Bible's chock full of promises about who you are. Ephesians says you are God's masterpiece. How many times do you look in the mirror and go, oh, masterpiece?
Rarely.
Yeah. Most, unless they're narcissistic, don't, right? Yeah. But he said, you are a masterpiece. And to recognize that what you do doesn't define you. What you do actually comes out of who you are. But that's a hard thing to learn. And then he begins to talk about these things called spiritual gifts. And he lists some gifts of prophecy and serving and teaching and encouragement and giving and leading, and he said, and mercy. And it's not an exhaustive list, but basically he's saying, if you really want to begin to repair relationships and be part of the cleaning, as you figure out who you are, figure out how God wired you, and lean into that wiring to be a blessing, to serve others. And because we were designed to do this.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to verse 2. This is different than the pattern of this world. But when you and I begin to serve others instead of protecting ourselves or saying, I'm too busy to do that, when we make it about helping others, it actually will begin to clean up those relational messes. Here's an example. And I know I'm kind of going into teaching mode on this, but here's an example of this in a marriage, dating relationship. A lot of times there'll be something about the other person, and I know there's nothing about Joanna that you've ever gone, oh, I wish she would change because she's perfect.
Exactly.
And she's got a whole list about you. But
also, exactly.
Well, I've been talking a lot for Joanna today. I'm sorry, Joanna. But we tend to want to go, I want this other person to change, in any kind of relationship. And God said, start with you. Start with you. I had a person tell me early on in our marriage, there was something that was really bothering me about Kylie, and she and I talked about it. And finally, this kind of mentor of mine said, why don't you start by serving her every day? And gave me this list of things to do. And I'm like, but I don't want to do those things. But it was amazing because they said, try it for 60 days, serve her in these ways, and don't bring up this thing that bothers you. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the 60 days, I didn't even realize that all of a sudden this thing that bothers me wasn't bothering me, but she began to, it began to change in her. Mm-hmm. Part of it is because she was responding to that act of love. So that's part of what this whole section is talking about. And it's interesting, if you look at this list of spiritual gifts in, verses 6 through 16. About 8. 6 through about 8. It's all these lists of spiritual gifts. And then verses 9 through 16, each verse, I never picked up on this till I studied this, each verse actually deals with a specific gift. And, like in prophecy, in verse 9 says, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Part of the challenge for a person who has the gift of prophecy is a person who has a gift of prophecy. It's not talking about the future. It's talking about the fact that you can recognize more clearly than most of us, here's what God says is right, here's what God says is wrong, and here are the consequences of this. And when you kind of have that gift, and I kind of lean into this, it's easy to be critical of people because you tend to see the wrong in people. And he's saying, okay, here's your weakness. And with each one of these things, he talks through this, and it goes back to self-awareness. Recognize what, and grow in your recognizing what your weakness is and what your strength is. Because what will bother you about other people and will bother you about the messiness of relationships normally flows out of your own weaknesses. As we work through that. So be aware of that. So he walks through all of these things, those who are serving, be devoted to one another in love, loving one another, teaching, never be lacking in zeal. One of the things that those who have the gift of teaching struggle with is like, but people aren't changing, so I'm going to give up.
Right.
Encouragement, mercy. I love with mercy in verse 16, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. One of the things that people with the gift of mercy, they'll be over here with someone celebrating, and then they're going to go, then they'll meet someone who is struggling, and they'll be crying with them, and they almost feel schizophrenic. It's like, I can't. It's saying that's just part of who you are. Your emotions are going to be empathetic with people, but just recognize that about yourself and grow in this. So I've talked in kind of circles around here, but Romans 12, I think, is a key to help us begin to grow in this. Recognize it's going to hurt, and then grow in self-awareness. Recognize how God wired you, some of these things. So I'm just curious with you, because I've done a lot of talking here. As you've grown over the years, what have been some things that you've done that have helped you just realize, oh, this is kind of who I am. This is how God's wired me. I didn't prepare you for this question at all.
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of specific things. Excuse me. I think, I think my relationships with others have taught me those things about myself, and that, like you were talking about earlier, where they can kind of hold the mirror up to you. And so I've had people kind of, speak into my life in certain ways, like, hey, this is an area you might need to work on in your life. I mean, in college, I was especially early on in college, I was an extremely prideful person. I was a pretty okay athlete, and I was, fairly intelligent, and so I could handle myself pretty well in a conversation, and I was very arrogant, and I had a few people at that college let me know how I was coming off, and how that was an area I needed to work on. And so and honestly, how it was affecting my relationships, even with them as my friends, just like, hey, it's not super fun to be around you when you're, And so I've had a lot of different instances like that in my life. I'm sure my wife has brought a few of them to my attention over the last 11 plus years now.
I'm curious, when you run across someone else who is arrogant, does that grate on you?
Yeah.
Are you harder on them?
I don't know if I'm harder on them because I see young David in them,
Okay.
but I identify it real quick.
Yeah.
And I even can, if it's someone that I have a relationship with, especially as a coach. So I've working with young college students, now high school students, it's something I can identify pretty quick and be like, you're a lot like I was when I was your age.
And that's part of the self-awareness. It's like, oh, that's who I am. And it can go one of two ways. And when you grow in recognizing that's who I am, you go, oh, I can identify. Either way, you're going to identify what is a weakness in you and someone else quickly. When you grow in self-awareness, it grows understanding and mercy.
Yep.
When you don't have the self-awareness, it grows judgment. And it's part of why Jesus said, be careful when you're judging other people. Pay attention to the log in your own eye. And you don't even realize it. But when you grow in self-awareness, that's part of how you know you're growing in this is if you begin to grow in understanding.
Yeah.
And that. I know you're not a big fan of like personality tests.
What? I think
we've talked about this before.
The most important. No, I don't like them at all.
But it's one of the ways, and it's a tool. We have to recognize it. It's not this is exactly who you are. They aren't perfect. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like them. But there are tools you can use along with spiritual gifts tests. Just this is how God's wired me. Here's strengths and weaknesses and tools for self-awareness.
Yeah.
And that's once you begin with a relationship with Christ, if you want to begin to pay attention to the relational world, pay attention to growing in who you are and who God hardwired you to be, and engage in that. We'll talk more in the coming weeks about some specifics, but that's really the big key if you want to be part of cleaning up the messes in your relational world.
You have any homework for us this week?
Sure. Read Romans 12. Read Romans 12 and see if you can connect the 4 messes from Genesis 3, distrust, blame, pain, difficult, to Romans 12. And you can do it, as you walk through that. But read that and see if you can connect that. And I would say as you come out of that, just come out with one action step. What's one thing you want to grow in me with this?
All right. Well, thank you. Excuse me, everybody. Thank you, Pastor Mike. I'm excited for this new series. I genuinely was sad when the last one was wrapping up. That the Best Year Yet ended up being one of my favorite series we've done since I've been at New Hope. But I'm really excited for this one as well. So
should we tease the upcoming topics?
Go for it. Yeah.
Sex, money, and forgiveness.
And rock and roll. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Close. Sex, money, forgiveness. So it's going to be an intense series and a fun series.
Yeah. And if you, like always, if you missed the weekend teaching, make sure you go to our website, newhopehere.com, or on our YouTube channel and catch up on the weekend teaching as well, because it definitely blends in with the Grow podcast. And as we always say here on the Grow podcast, growth always starts with the next step. So let's make sure we take that next step this week. Let's read Romans 12, see if we can connect those 4 things from Genesis 3 to Romans 12. And thank you again for being here with us. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next week.